So welcome and thank you for having us. It's great to be here, all of that. So this is a little bit of a strange panel. And so what I'm going to go through is do really fast introduction of context and what we think we're going to talk about so that people who find that dreary and annoying can leave, or just do IRC, that's fine too. And then the rest of you can get all riled up and cranky, and we can have a good, honest discussion / argument about this, which I think the talk immediately preceding this definitely led into. So here's what we think we're going to do. We think I'm going to give 5 minutes of what we think we're doing. We're going to get very short statements from the panelists answering some loaded questions designed to provoke controversy. See, I did that just for my cues, the little British thing going on. Then we're going to have a debate amongst the crowd up here, not because we like to hear ourselves talk so much as what we want to do is get the discussion going and give you all a flavor of where people are coming from and what their positions are on some of these issues. And then finally, the bulk of the time we'd like to devote to the kind of conversation that just got started about what kind of mess we're in and whether there's any way out of it and what that would look like. So here's the context. I believe, and I think some of the panelists may also believe, but I won't blame them for this, that there are a ton of v6 skeptics out there. And people who are rabid v6 proponents believe that all people who think anything is wrong with v6 are lazy or ignorant. And to some extent, I mean, many of us are lazy and ignorant, and sometimes even about v6, but it's not universally the case. There are many smart, clueful people who run networks. Well, maybe it is, but it's not really. So there are many smart, clueful people who run good networks, who know what they're doing, who think that v6 is somewhat or a complete train wreck. And what I see in the discussion, and I think that's okay. It's perfectly okay to say those people are wrong, and they may well be wrong. But what I don't see is that perspective really coming out in public conversation. And so I think it does the entire community and the future of our profession a disservice to not raise these questions very publicly. And if people are simply wrong, then let's put forth good, solid arguments about why they're wrong and why everything is rosy and hunky-dory, and continue to have other discussions and debates. So there's that piece, and then the other piece is that everyone acknowledges, even very, very serious v6 proponents who think it's the only solution and must be done immediately, that the rollout is mostly stalled. Allocations and new announcements peaked in 2003. There's no traffic, there's no users, there's no reason yet, and nobody's positive when the IP space runs out, and that's the main reason that everyone's looking for. So in the context of those two issues, here are the key questions that we're going to have the panel address. And the questions are intentionally loaded. So I'll state the questions, and then I'll introduce the panel, and they will provide their own answers to each of these questions. So the first set of questions is, how bad is v6? Will anything else be at all even plausibly better? And who could, should, will do anything about it? Which I think the presentation immediately before this raised some interesting issues about that. The key question as we discuss this as a panel leading up to this that pretty much colors all of your other answers is, how long do we have? So there are many, many numbers floating out there. Some people's numbers have already been obviated by time because 2006 or 5 has come and gone and we still have v4 allocation space. But there's some future out there that is coming where we won't. And so there are key questions of when that is, and the implicit question is, do we have time to make any significant fixes if the answer is v6 has anything wrong with it? And then the remaining questions are there any ways to extend that time, and what the heck happened to scalable routing? So with those in mind, let me go through the panelists. We'll start with answers to those questions on the left. Dave Meyer.
What were those questions? Oh, yeah. Okay.
Right there. Look,
all right. Do I have to read those? Okay, so as many of you know, okay, so how bad is v6? I don't know. What I started off with was, okay, so I got nominated and put on the IAB, and I thought to myself, okay, you know, here's the IETF, maybe they're supposed to be, maybe this is the answer to one of these, should or could anyone do something about it? And I thought, well, you know, I'm hanging around with my friends here in NANOG and this community, and you know, it's pretty clear that we don't have a scalable routing and addressing architecture for the internet, at least in the IPv6 context, and certainly a lot of people would argue in the IPv4 context as well. So I thought, well, hey, you're on the IAB, maybe that's something you ought to look at. Seems like a problem. So I've spent the last, 2 years really banging on that, and I've tried a couple of different things. We did the BOF thing. That didn't work too well because there were a lot of political reasons why that didn't work too well. So then we decided that, well, hey, maybe we'll hold a workshop because that's one of the buttons the IAB can push. They really can't do that much, but we can organize people. So we're going to try that, and that will be next week. It was, by the way, it was really difficult to organize that. It continues to be difficult to organize that. Can't get all the people you want, get some of the people you don't want, all of that kind of stuff. And it's troublesome, but, we had to try to do something. And so I'm kind of at the point with, on the who could or should do something about it. I'm very skeptical that the IETF can do anything about this, but we're going to try, at least in my tenure on the IAB, one more time. And
so Dave, your main issue is v6 is bad because there's no scalable routing, and the IAB maybe can fix it, but you're not sure.
I think that... Okay,
it's my job to grossly simplify everything.
Yeah, okay, that's grossly simplifying, yeah, sure. I don't know, there's no scalable routing architecture. That's going to be bad no matter what the substrate is, right? So that's a problem. And regarding the IETF, like I said, it's been 10 years now, and I don't see any real evidence that anything else is going on. So that's, that's troublesome.
Okay.
So that also answers the what happened to the scalable routing question, right? I mean, well, we didn't do anything about it. That's what happened to it.
All right. Dan Golding.
Sure. How bad is v6? Well, it's pretty bad. When we're in a situation where we're getting reasonably close to v4 adoption and we're having to have presentations like Marla's presentation that we just had, we shouldn't be having presentations like Marla's presentation at this point. It's not to say she shouldn't have given that presentation, it's just that she shouldn't have had to. So we're in kind of bad shape because we have to be able to multi-home. We need scalable routing. We need something that the vendors and the operators can live with. The IETF has fiddled while Rome has burnt, and now we're in kind of a bad position. How long do we have? Well, I think 2011 is a reasonable number. I think some of the alarmist, we're going to run out of address space in 2007, have been proven inaccurate, but I think Jeff's numbers are good. I think we may be forced to have a market for IP address allocation. I know there's a lot of people who find that to be the devil. But I think there's not going to be a lot of choice because I think no matter what solution we go with, we're not going to be ready in 2011 for wide-scale, complete IPv6 deployment based on what we've seen so far. And that market for v4 space is going to extend the time. And it's not even necessarily going to be the people here or the people at Aaron or Ripe who are going to decide this. When I talk to a lot of enterprise, Fortune 500, Global 2000 type enterprises about their v4 and v6 plans, and I say, well, what are you going to do when the v4 space runs out? They just laugh and say, well, I'm going to buy some. And I'm going to say, well, you're not going to be allowed to do that. And they're going to say, stop me. Well, good luck. You're not going to be able to stop them. And the scalable routing issue is something that has to be resolved now. It has to be resolved separately. We're trying to use v6 and policy to resolve a scalable routing issue that is somewhat disconnected. I mean, it's time to solve that, and then at the same time, but in a different track, figure out what our next IP routing protocol is.
Okay. Jason Schiller.
So the way I think about this in two ways. The first thing is v6 had a very narrow charter. We were running out of addresses. We wanted more. We have plenty now. So v6 has done a great job at that. We have lots of addresses. Hooray. The problem is it really hasn't considered all the problems that these extra addresses are creating. And those really need to be addressed. And without addressing those problems, having lots of addresses doesn't help you very much.
So we're going to continue the conversation. Panelists will debate, ask each other, antagonize each other. As they do that, when they say things you think are woefully incorrect or hatefully wrong, make a note of that so that when I ask for audience participation, you'll be ready to go.
Todd, are you going one by one?
So I just wanted to kind of amplify a little bit on Jason's point, which was I think IPv6 has really exacerbated things by virtue of the very problem it was trying to solve, which is larger address space. And if you couple that with no way to do multi-homing, no way to do routing, none of that, what you find out is, and
In a scalable way.
in a scalable way. Yeah, let that be the case. We want it to work, okay? So you can do a lot of things that don't work. I mean, we built a lot of stuff that doesn't work. But the problem really is look what's happening right now. What we're doing is recreating the IPv4 swamp, which we worked so hard to get rid of, at a massive scale that, it really won't be very tractable if it actually unfolds the way it's looking like it could. So I think that these things put together add up to something very, very dire.
Yeah, and I guess one of the important questions really is how long do we have? And there's various projections, 2016, 2012, 2008. I don't know, maybe we'll have V6 adoption in 2028 when Brendan gets out of prison. The point here is, what's not under debate is we're running out. We will run out at some point, and we will have to do something different. And as an ISP who delivers internet service, we really have to be aggressive on when we think that date may be, because if that date comes sooner than we're ready or prepared for, we're screwed.
Well, so let's address that specifically, Jason, and well, all of you, but Jason, so how much time do you think we have, and what kind of fixes are you willing to entertain? Can we change the header format? Should we leave the header format out? Can you shoehorn scalable routing into the existing header format somehow?
So on the question of how much time do we have, I don't know. I think that there have been some people that have done some good work on this. The numbers that bookend it right now are 2008, 2012. Vince Cerf said, maybe we're not going to run out by 2010, but there'll be so much pressure on address space that it'll only be fulfilled by V6. I have to be ready. I have to be ready by 2010, whether that's the drop dead date or not. Because if that does turn out to be the drop date dead and I'm not ready, then I don't have a network to sell.
Okay. Same question.
So one of the things I've suggested doing, and this is more of a research problem or issue, is to kind of look at whether or not it might not be possible to preserve some of the investment. If the idea is that, oh well, maybe IPv6 isn't going to get us there in the time we want in the current structure of things, whether or not it would be possible to preserve our investment in all of the stuff around V6, like forwarding engines and things like that, and use the packet format, not necessarily all of the protocol machinery that went around it. And I don't know if that's possible or not, but I've been looking at it a little bit with some chip guys at Cisco, and it seems like it could be done, but you need a design around that first. So.
Yeah. All right. So the crowd's queuing up already, which is exactly what we hoped for. So Joel, I think you were there first.
Joel Yegley. While we're on the subject of dates, I mean, the one that scares me is what's the date when the IPv6 routing system looks as bad as the IPv4 routing system?
Well,
right? I mean, that's sort of the point of no return, I think, right? Because that means IPv6 has been successful enough that it's deployed.
I don't think we have to worry about that. I mean, in all honesty.
Well, then we don't actually need to be here because it won't become relevant.
Well, here's the thing. We need a new routing system. We need a new addressing system. They're not necessarily linked together. We can hopefully reuse significant parts of V6 like the packet header, but I don't think we have to be sitting around kind of being worried that V6 will be successful, because at this point, just looking at the adoption has really been very low. Look at China. I mean, Asia was supposed to drive V6 adoption. There you have networks that are being forced by the government to run V6, but it's all IPv4 traffic that they're tunneling.
Well, I mean, if it's not successful, then we don't have a routing scalability problem, and we can declare victory and go home. It just means that that just means that we're all living in V4 land.
Well, no, it means we're still stuck in V4 land with the problems that we have here, which is we're going to run out of address space, right?
Yeah, I mean, the perception from a lot of folks, from enterprises, from a lot of operators is that, V6 has all the problems of V4 and meets fewer of our requirements.
And larger address space.
Yeah, and larger addresses, too,
Randy
Bush, IIJ. First, Todd, if you haven't heard publicly, loudly, that V6 is sorely broken, you shouldn't be here. You should be a near doctor. Secondly, the global routing scaling problem is one of global state and scoping. Nobody is addressing this in any reasonable fashion anywhere. 3 is the issue in the routing table that we have today makes very clear that hacks such as separation of location identifier, which is the current sub-religion in the IETF, is not going to solve, because if you actually look at the routing table today, you will see that the majority of the prefixes are there either for somebody's traffic engineering, which more address space and other things and so on and so forth are not going to solve, or are there because people like Time Warner Telecom take their address space and slice it up into /24s because they think it solves a security problem, namely route hijacking. Thank you, thank you, thank you. But lots of people do it. The majority of the routing table contains that. The only approach that we have for that, and it's yet another hack, is decent routing security so they won't feel that need. And to address traffic engineering with something other than wires over IP over wires.
Is that just, do we have deafening silence from the panel on any of that? We could be done. So usually when Randy talks, then you're done, I think.
I'll just say I don't disagree with anything that Randy just said.
Can we go home now?
Hi, it's Alain Durand from Comcast. I came here essentially thinking it was a V6 pragmatic panel where people on the panel will have opposite sides. I'm kind of surprised to see that everybody is on the same side on this panel, so it's a little bit surprising. So I decided to hijack this process and came here on the microphone to say that I cannot disagree with you.
This is not a hijacking of the process. This is the process as it was designed. It's working well. Thank you.
Okay, great. If you design it to be hijacked, that's fine. So how about this V6? Trying to answer myself the questions. Well, I guess pretty bad, because there's a number of things that have never been completely thought of. And what happened to the scalable routing protocols is one of them, but there are many others, like, okay, you have this huge address space. What do you do with reverse DNS? What do you do with the HTTP address allocation? What do you do with your filters? And how do you manage this address space? A lot of those questions have never been answered. And that's kind of normal because we are just starting now to deploy this stuff. So we are learning now how to solve those problems. Are there big enough problems to solve the deployment? In my personal opinion, no. We can still do that. So how long do we have? In our case, we have essentially -1 year. What? Because we actually ran out of private address space last year.
Todd, could you ask him to
So your claim is that we're currently out of unallocated V4 space as of last year?
I'm saying that as of last year, this has become a huge problem, a critical problem in my company. And we're going to need a very, very large amount of addresses. You can see my previous presentation at NANOG in San Jose in June this year. We are going to need several hundred million IP addresses in the near future. It's really hard for us to conceive how we are going to get those things. So it's a really, really serious immediate problem. So you think about, okay, market allocation of addresses. Okay, let's do some quick math here. Let's say $1 an IP address per month. That seems like a reasonable figure. Do you know really how much money this means? It means that for /8, we are talking essentially at $1 billion over 10 years. And I don't know about any company that's willing to pay $1 billion over 10 years for /8. Then we will need something like 10 or 20 or maybe 30 of those. This is simply not going to work. If you think it's going to work...
Hold on a sec. How are you getting to $1 billion using any realistic method? You're talking about $1 per IP address per year sort of thing? Is that what you're talking about?
No, $1 per IP address per month.
Under what scheme has that ever been proposed by anyone? And
Well,
who would you be
that's a number that is very easy to think about. You think it's something that is low value? Okay, put $1 a month. If you have people that are paying something like $30 a month to get service, maybe $1 a month is not that stupid. Okay? So we are talking about a lot of money here if we're talking about a market.
I think I don't think anyone has proposed the idea of renting IP addresses for $1 a month. I don't think that's what we're talking about with a market. With a market, we're not really talking about leases or rentals. We're talking about the ability of folks to sell IP addresses to each other in order to lengthen the, because right now, if you look at the IPv4 address space, the allocation is very poor. It's very uneven. There's a lot of hoarding. Everyone here knows all the examples of extreme hoarding. And
Actually, many of the examples of extreme hoarding are in this room.
yeah, many of the examples of extreme hoarding in this room.
point that
There's a lot in the enterprise space as well. It's been a historic problem. The method we have of allocation now tends to lead to hoarding, not just of IP addresses really, but of any kind of thing. And if we had a market, we could probably increase our utilization efficiency greatly in order to give us more time to figure out a solution. Because right now, as you saw from the last presentation, we don't have a viable IPv6 solution that fits the requirements of most folks.
Well, that's one point of view. The other point of view is to say, well, if you don't do V6 now, there is no other alternative solution on the table. So first you are forced into this market solution where you are going to pay a lot of money. So essentially your question is, because we don't have scalable routing in V6 means that we should never do V6, and we should go back to the drawing board and start over from scratch. I think my position is somewhat different. Is if we don't do V6, we're dead, essentially. So we'll do V6 and we'll be forced into reinventing later on the road a scalable solution. As we have to make sure that we do not put the horse before the carriage here. We need to have more addresses, period.
So are you proposing to do IPv6 like IPv4 of PI address space, kind of cruise forward in our current routing situation, and then at some point in the future fix that?
Essentially, yes.
Okay. That's...
I have a question. There's some unused address space, like the so-called Class E address space, or the Class D address space. I mean, there might be a possibility of repurposing some of that stuff for to kind of get a little more life out of the V4 system, and we haven't really investigated that one either.
I think
We did some
when Jeff looked at that,
and if you can certify that every single vendor in the universe will work with those kind of addresses, then
hey, no fighting at the mic. Hey! I will pull this conference over and I will drive it home. Sorry, go ahead. Dan. So the proposal's on the table. I know it's your favorite proposal, Jason, to cruise forward PI space in V6 and hope to fix it later.
2005 won forever, man.
Can we get some vendors at the mic? When am I going to see some routers that can hold millions of routes in the fib?
And on that note, there's a vendor, Chris.
I'm not a router vendor. They don't let me design networks. Are you kidding? So I have a couple. Sorry, I'm Chris from Verizon Business. There's been a couple of discussions like this in the last couple of days. And so what problem are we really trying to solve? Is it the fact that people use some craziness in BGP to do traffic engineering, which is what Randy basically said, to some extent? Is it that there's going to be too many routes if we turn on V6 today equal to V4, or in 10 years there's going to be too many routes? Is it too many routes because of the traffic engineering artifacts, or is it because there's too many destinations that have unique prefixes, /32s in the instance of today's policy? So whatever comes out of this, maybe it's not BGP as you know it today. Maybe there's a new BGP, which maybe means there's a new TCP/IP as well, because there's some difference between what you think of an IP address is today and what it's going to be tomorrow, the locator ID split business, which maybe that's the right answer or not, that's not my purview. But solving the right problem is the important part. If the right problem is that in 10 years I have to be able to jam 30,000 updates through my hardware in my router down to the fib, can I do that today? I don't know. What if I have to do 300,000? Figure out the right problem you're trying to solve and solve that. But we get distracted with the traffic engineering discussion, I think.
Well, I think so. One of the questions that I've heard up here and heard other people raise is, isn't it kind of late in the game to be having this conversation?
I think I said the last person, maybe it's 5 years, maybe it's a little bit more, but every day we sit here is one day less to solve it. It's going to take at least 2 years for my company to certify any new code that has any new protocol. So now I have less than 3 years. Please get me something that works.
All right.
That may be, but if you had to roll out some new routing protocol, it's not going to happen tomorrow for you either. And you know damn well that your vendor is not going to give you bug-free software on the first time.
All right. What's that? All right.
I don't own my vendor like you do, Ted.
On that note, in the back, in the middle.
Kevin Oberman from ESNet. For those of you who are talking about dates, unfortunately, for those of us in the government sector, which I sort of straddle, the date is 2008, period, no exceptions, because OMB has said, we will run IPv6, no exceptions, or you get your funding shut off in 2008. So lots and lots of people in the government think they're going to be running IPv6 very soon. I know that from the number of people calling us saying, can we get together to discuss implementation of IPv6 since you've already done it and we have no idea? I've been getting a lot of those calls lately.
Yeah, just to answer this. I do a lot of work
Yes,
with...
this is Gossip V2, and we all know we're running cons and CLNS today, so...
Just to answer that, I work with a lot of government agencies and have, including some in sort of the defensive type sector of agencies, the ones you think would be sort of behind this. And, you know, a lot of these guys are spending a lot of money now on consultants to do two things. One is to try to figure out how to implement it, and the other is to get them to write papers saying why they shouldn't implement it that they can send to the OMB. You know, there's a feeling in government that this is a ridiculous unfunded mandate and that they have huge other problems that they need to spend their money on. And the interesting thing is government, for the most part, has plenty of IP addresses. If you actually look at the IPv4 address space, you know, and almost everything is NATed in government for security reasons anyway. You know, this is really a case where I suspect the vendors have done bad things. The router vendors have influenced people in the U.S. government, at least, and certainly some Asian governments, to do stuff that they shouldn't have done, which is mandate IPv6 by 2008, and it's really sort of corrupt.
Absolutely. It's, well, as Vince said a moment ago, if everybody didn't hear him, Gossip V2. I mean, yes, we've all been there, we've all tripped over it. Well, those of us who are old enough have been there and tripped over it, and we're not real happy about having to do it again. As far as writing white papers, back long before the OMB mandate came out, we wrote a very long, detailed explanation to OMB of why this, from a DOE perspective, was a very, very bad idea. And you can see how OMB responded to our long and very thoughtful document on the subject. So while I'm not at all convinced it's going to happen, I've got to pretend it's going to happen and make darn sure it can happen if nothing changes down the road. And I'm not the only one in that position.
Yeah, I just want to say that if you're here and you work for a major router vendor, that, you know, of course you're not personally responsible, but you should ponder the fact that your company has pressured government officials into implementing something that is clearly not ready to be implemented, and that is really a sort of questionable ethical standing.
Excellent. Over on the far side.
Hi, Josh Lovelace, Utah Education Network. Some of us actually have IPv6 deployed in the backbone. In fact, some of us already have it provisioned down to the desktop. And admittedly, there's not a lot of people using it, but for the last 3 years, we've had to make decisions, all the decisions on what we buy, software, hardware, everything. We're looking at, well, can we support IPv6 with this, you know, deployment? So for me, if being here, you know, we've heard nothing but gripes about IPv6, most of which I frankly agree with. But if this is going to be a pragmatic discussion of V6, maybe the panel could take just a few minutes and describe or explain maybe their alternatives, their ideas on solutions, how we could solve it, rather than listening to the same gripes we've been hearing for the last 5 years.
Yep, thanks. So let's give that a shot. Go.
Well, so what I did about it, my personal input to that one was I got on the IAB and I tried to push on it as hard as I could. And what we're doing right now is we're going to hold a workshop next week in Amsterdam where we're going to try to really come away with a concise problem statement. It's not like we don't know what the problem statement is, but it's like more like what Chris was saying. We need a common understanding of that and come away with that as a substrate for future work, and then we'll test and see if the IETF can actually do anything about this. But, you know, from my perspective, you know, there's a lot of routing research out there. There's a lot of things going on in various SDOs, standards developing organizations and stuff around us, but none of that work, as far as I can tell, is directly linked to our community here, and so a lot of it just misses the problem altogether. so that's what I did about it. Now, your question was, do you have a solution to it? Well, if I did, I probably wouldn't tell you because, I'd be out patenting it or something like that. But I mean, it's a real hard problem, obviously, and we got to start somewhere. And like Chris said, today's the best day to start. So that's what I tried to do. That was the approach I took.
I'd have to say that the approach that can work that people have talked up here a little bit about is that there's been a tremendous investment into the IPv6 packet header. So I think the IPv6 packet header is not particularly flawed. I think that's something we can all probably live with and craft a solution on top of. I think at this point we have to come to a couple realizations. The realizations are, for people who are IPv6 skeptics, we're running out of IPv4 space. We have to have something else. There's simply no other solution. We can't do IPv4 forever. Be it 2011, be it 2025. But because of what Chris was talking about, our time frames are really much more limited than this would suggest. And even in a market-based solution, it wouldn't be a perfect market-based solution. Let's face the facts. So we probably don't have until 2027, even in that scenario. So what we need to do is we need to get real, and we need to say the IETF, and no offense to anyone who's, well, I guess maybe offense to people who are involved with the IETF, is that the IETF hasn't worked. They've been working on this for a long time. And insanity is usually defined as someone who tries to do something. Last time it didn't work, and the time before it didn't work, and the time before it didn't work. You do something again and hope you're going to get a different result.
I believe you just called Dave insane.
Yeah, that's sorry. It's classically defined as insanity. So we're in a situation where we have to say the IETF is not, cannot, will not do it. And at that point, we need to look for other avenues and other people.
Sure. Yeah. You're not the first person who said I'm insane, so I'm not taking any problem with that. It's not the same. There are new people with new ideas and that kind of stuff. And that exactly the fact that it's not the same now, that we have different people involved, is what gives me what little bit of hope I have that maybe we can make something happen. Now, I'll agree with you. It's a huge uphill battle, and there's a lot. And if the past is a good predictor of the future, well then, yeah.
So for me, there's really a simple decision that has to be made. Either we can continue what we've been doing, we can grow the routing table, and we can beat up our vendors to produce gear that's bigger, and hopefully they can, and somebody should seriously look at that. Or we have to do something different. Maybe a different protocol, maybe not BGP, maybe something that's got hierarchy in the network. I don't know, maybe the locator ID split will help this problem. Maybe we can arrange the locators in a way that it's dynamic and hierarchical, that can change as the routing topology changes. The question is, how do you map the locator to the ID? How do you do that in a way that scales, and do you end up with less state than what you had when everyone deaggregated? I don't know. But I mean, these are things that we have to seriously look at. Either we keep doing what we're doing and we figure out how to make the routers bigger and better and cooler and better cooling and better power conservation and much, much larger memory structures and faster CPUs, or we write another protocol that'll scale. Or conversely, we give up some of the functionality we have. But people here don't seem to want to do that. People here don't seem to want to advertise only a single aggregate. People here don't seem to want to only use provider aggregatable space. So, I mean, it's a trade-off.
Sure.
Brian Dixon again. I think you're getting very close to nailing the problem on the head, which is that of global announcements of provider independent space and avoiding deaggregation of aggregatable space. In IPv4, there's a new proposed extension for AS path limit, and I think that would very well be applicable to IPv6 and BGP in terms of limiting the scope of how much a de-aggregated amount of space can be carried, how far it can reach. But that gives you local scope to the traffic engineering without having global routing table pollution.
But here's the question I have about that. The reason people accept all the de-aggregates is because that means it makes money for them, and people like to make money. And so the largest routing table generates the largest amount of traffic because it's got the largest number of more specifics.
There's also one other thing that people need to keep in mind here. A lot of solutions get proposed based on the idea that people are going to be good citizens. And we've seen this in the past. People will turn in their IP address space, and people will deliberately limit the scope of their advertisements. There's psychology here. We have to assume that the people on the edge who are advertising a lot of these routes either have no interest in being altruistic because it's not going to make their company money, and therefore they should have no interest in being altruistic, or they're ignorant and they simply won't do it. We can't assume clueful altruistic people are running BGP because they're not.
Yeah, with regard to the AS hop limit, I'm not sure that helps the problem much. The tier 1 ISPs are very heavily peered, very densely peered. The tier 2 ISPs are peered even more heavily, more densely. The average radius of the internet is like what, 4.5 ASs, 5 ASs?
Right, it's very short now.
So, I don't think that's going to help the problem space very much. If somebody's multi-homed to 2 upstream ISPs, and those ISPs happen to be 3 ASs away from each other, and your blast radius is 3 ASs, that's going to affect what, all tier 1 and tier 2 ISPs pretty much are going to have to carry that route?
The internet. The internet at 3. Yeah.
So just to follow up on my own original comment, I'm not saying that it's going to be the panacea. It's not going to solve everything, but there are additional enforcement mechanisms you could build into the protocol, such as a more specific should only be accepted if it has an AS path limit on it. That would prevent the edge rogues from having something which can be announced with indefinite amount of scope. But as long as it's aggregatable and it's a PA space address, then it makes sense for it to actually be aggregated at some point.
So if somebody wants to multi-home and do traffic engineering, they should get PI space? Is that what you're saying?
Yes. The PI space, by definition, should be given out to anybody who needs to multi-home.
And if everyone who's multi-homing gets PI space, we're going to have less routes somehow?
The theory goes that if you limit the scope to the traffic engineering component of that, and you have everybody who's multi-homed have a single prefix of arbitrary size appropriate to them,
so
you
then
end up with
no traffic engineering. Everyone gets one route.
Everyone gets one route, and the ability to make more specifics out of that with a scope limit on how far that more specific gets announced.
A scope limit like an AS scope limit?
Yes.
Okay.
In the middle and the back? Okay. I know, finally, you thought I'd forgotten about you. Right there. You, yeah.
I mean, I'm not a routing guy, but I'm in academia, so which is dangerous. One of the problems, if I look at what research gets done in that, is that there tend to be reasonably crisp problems where you can identify a specific problem with reasonably constrained parameters. And what I'm hearing is that the routing problem is really not a routing problem, but it's we need to solve all problems from traffic engineering to security to routing to business models to who knows what else, politics, all in one mechanism, and any one solution. It's essentially impossible for any one person to have that all in their head at once. So unless somebody's willing to scope a problem in such a way that it is manageable from a single person perspective, I don't see that we're going to get anywhere, because most solutions that get anywhere in the IETF originate with 1 or 2 people that are able in their own head to contain the solution and make progress on it. It's not going to arrive magically out of some however wise body. So to convert these insanity version is we've had the kind of a dieter version. I want to keep eating what I'm eating, but I want to lose 20 pounds at the same time. I mean, that's what I'm hearing here. I don't want to change anything. I don't want to pay any more. I don't want to change protocols, but it should magically work better. I mean, how is that going to work?
So I don't disagree with what you're saying, but I think the difficult question here is which are the problems that are worth solving and what functionality is everyone willing to give up? So
now, I've yet to hear one thing somebody's willing to give up.
Do you have any comments on that?
But Jason, no one's willing to give up functionality. I mean, let's be perfectly honest. Well, this has been the line for years, especially with Shim6. Well, someone is going to have to suffer, so it's going to be the Leaf network. Well, those guys aren't willing to do it. I mean, the enterprises, in an extremely rare display, came out to Aaron to support, IPv6 PI space, and you never see those guys there. And it's because they were sufficiently alarmed at the idea of Shim6. I think we're not going to see people willing to give up real functionality.
One final question I had in terms of market was mentioned is, well, if announcing address space is costing the community at large, why not make that a chargeable commodity? I mean, basically, you don't get announced unless a check is attached to the announcement.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Sean Duran came up with the charging for slots in his AGS Plus about, what, 15 years ago or something like that.
Jared.
Hello, Jared Mach, NTT America. So I'm not actually fully convinced that the V6 problem is something that we need to necessarily even address at this point. Because, there's a number of issues, a number of flaws in stacking on all sorts of extra headers and labels and all these other things on top. Where's the pain now with the V6? So OMB told the US government they have to go and, all the departments have to go and do V6, but I don't really see where the pain is right now for everyone. It's not like OMB and GSA are coming to every single provider in this room and saying, we want to buy internet access from you. They basically go through the same contractor purchasing side stuff that they do everything else through, and generally end up with the same couple of providers. And one or two of them, like MCI, Verizon Business, whatever you're called today, Jason, just picking on the name changes, those, it tends to be
Where are
pretty
you
small.
from again? Is it Vario? What?
What?
Is it Vario?
I don't know. So the point is, I'm not exactly sure that this is even a real issue for 99% of the people in this room. There's a small set of people in the room who are going to deploy V6 because they need it for the little checkbox on the form for selling to the government. But for the rest of the people here, they haven't adopted V6, and this doesn't necessarily represent a real issue to the operations of their network.
But you need
Jared,
to go,
when does
Jared,
this become a real issue?
You just got to go back to the premise that we're going to run out of IP space at some point, and if you believe that, then what does the clock look like? And if the clock is running, you got N years to solve it. We've shown that we're not particularly efficient at solving this problem, so.
Up to this point, but I would argue that there's no immediate incentive to fix the problem. It's not like people are having to go through and upgrade the memory in their routers to hold larger routing tables and such and do other activities, but they're not in a position where they've run out of the hardware forwarding space yet. And in the cases where they are approaching some of those limits, those people tend not to be on the latest, greatest hardware that the vendor is currently shipping. And so there is an expensive path for them to take, but there's not no path for them to take.
But Jared, when does it become a problem? 5 years, 10 years?
I don't know when.
Think long term here.
But we've run through a number of these types of things before. There was this problem with, address space and having enough, and then all of a sudden somebody decided, hey, cool, let's go and do this CIDR thing. And we've seen different things happen.
Don't forget NAT. NAT helps too.
I think I've got a comment on where the pain is. If
there's actually, so Ted's walking away because he's been waiting a long time.
No, I just wanted to address that one comment on pain.
There's a really long.
Renumbering is pain. If there's a change to the V6 system after deployment, that causes pain.
Okay.
I'm not necessarily sure that the V6 system as it exists today is the replacement for the problem of we don't have enough address space, if that is the problem.
I'm not positive we understand this point.
I would like to
wait, hold on, Jared. Jared, hold on. Say that again.
I'm not sure that V6 is even necessarily the right solution. It is a solution for the not enough address space problem. It's basically V4 with a lot more bits and some extra space for some security headers and other stuff that people think needs to be there. But it's not necessarily, if the solution is not enough numbers, we can add more bits. And that's sort of what V6 provides. Solving the scalability of the routing system or when is something totally separate.
So I'm trying to understand, so your point is V6 isn't a problem because people aren't migrating to it yet, and we're not out of V4 space yet, and V6 isn't a good solution anyway?
V6 is a solution. V6 is a solution. I don't think it's the best solution that we could engineer if we got a couple of the people
I'll have to agree with that.
together.
Yeah.
But it is a solution, and it's a solution that people are spending some amount of money on. So there is a small market for it. It's not big enough for everyone in the room to get a piece of it in the same way the V4 is, but there is a market.
You know, one thing that you said, and I thought someone else said it too, which I want to challenge just a little bit, was you said that the routing system and the addressing system are independent, or decoupled or something like that, right?
I don't think that was...
Pardon?
I don't think that was me. I think that it was somebody else.
Okay, then I'll pursue that.
All right. Ted.
I think Elaine wanted to make a comment to Jared's comment. If you want to let him go, it's okay with me.
All right.
I will make it fast. I will essentially agree with the previous speaker saying that today's problem for those of us who are trying to deploy this thing is not the routing problem. The current problem that I'm facing, the hardest one, is to get my vendors to get the software work on IPv6 and not for a checkbox item because I really need to deploy it. So that's my immediate problem. The day my routing tables will grow and I will suffer the pain of, oh, I need to replace all my routers and every 6 months because the routing tables are growing too fast, then that day you will see a lot of interest trying to solve this problem. And I've been coming to NANOG and many other meetings for the last couple of years where people have been screaming out loud, oh, scalable routing solution, and nothing had happened. And why nothing had happened? Because nobody cares today, because this is not a problem.
So we should wait until the top 2 or 3 largest ISPs melt down first?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Excellent. A clear statement, boldly stated. That's what we're looking for.
Seemingly irresponsible, but bold and clear.
Sometimes those things go together. Yes.
Ted Seeley from Sprint, but I'm going to pick on Jason since that seems to be the theme here. Jason, let's pretend it's 5 years from now. I just called your desk. I'm the VP of Sales, and I asked you, how much more can we charge a customer who wants us to deaggregate their V6 allocation and announce their more specifics?
That's a very hard question. Really, the way I look at it is there's a cost associated with scaling the memory structure in all of our routers globally, or in the region where this route is going to be deaggregated to. If one of my customers wants to deaggregate to me, certainly they're paying me, they should be able to do that. But me re-advertising that to the global internet routing table is something altogether different. It's not clear how a routing economy would work. Because I'm advertising more specifics to my peers, would I pay them for my more specifics? Would they pay me for their more specifics? If somebody is running BGP with one of my peers and is getting full routes, does somebody pay them to carry those routes? It's not clear how all this money would move around, and if you could actually charge enough to pay for all of the people involved to upgrade all of the memory that they need to upgrade. Ted, did I answer your question?
There's no real answer, Jason. It's really a rhetorical, hypothetical question. Classify it however you want, but that is a dilemma that you're going to have to face, and I'm going to have to face, and someone's going to sell it and sign a contract, and you're going to have to do it.
The hard
sell,
sell,
as well as I do.
The hard sell is going to be, look, this customer wants to advertise deaggregates to traffic engineer. If we tell them no, they're going to take their OC12 over to somebody else who will do it.
Exactly. So you will do it because there's revenue on the table. That's the problem.
Okay, Ted, I have a question for you before you go anywhere. What is the probability that your company or a hypothetical tier 1 ISP is willing to de-peer another transit-free, settlement-free carrier because they're de-aggregating too much?
But we did before, so why would we do it again?
Yeah, what's
for de-aggregation?
For de-aggregation?
No.
No, we never did. I mean, Jesus, go back to Sean. I mean, he filtered half the damn internet, and then we unfiltered half the damn internet, and everybody else unfiltered half the damn internet, and nobody got de-peered.
Okay, so I'm sorry, you said you've never done it before, so why would you?
I'm saying the history will repeat itself. It will happen again, and no one's going to get de-peered.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is that, you know, the only way that people are going to cough up money to each other is with a gun to their head. I mean, that's how this industry works, right?
Yeah, reciprocity, yeah.
You know, so there are going to have to be credible threats made and carried out, and I don't see that on the near term. Maybe that's 5 or 10 years away, but Right now, there would have to be a crisis before people are willing to take the risk of partitioning the internet or seriously impacting internet reachability.
That's not the point, though, Dan.
So the point is that the optimal solution is to get to a crisis and then sort of let the market sort it out, and it will efficiently do so. That's not
point is
unreasonable.
the same policies that are in place for V6 are almost identical to the policies that were in place for V4. Thou shalt not do this, be a bad internet citizen, and guess what's going to happen, man? When there's enough money in someone's hand, the sales guy makes his living selling it.
Yeah, I mean things happen because money flows.
I mean, it comes down to there's a problem that needs to be solved. Money will solve it, or policy will solve it, one or other. And it's not 5 years, Ted. I think the request should be filtering to your desk pretty soon, and probably yours too, Jason.
Okay. So just to follow up on that real quickly, I have the inverse of Ted's question, which is a customer of yours comes to you and says, I can't get to xyzcompany.com because they're advertising a more specific that you, my ISP, are not listening to. Please put that route in your routing table. Who pays for that?
Yep, absolutely. Over on the side.
Yeah, Josh Lovelace for Utah Education Network again. This is just a quick counterpoint to the gentleman who made a statement earlier about people who don't have the latest, greatest hardware and have to worry about this. We've got a network made of backbone's got 20 GSRs in it. We've bought what we can afford. It's the latest and greatest that we can afford, right? I've got a multicast table. I've got an IPv6 table. I've got IPv4 tables. We're doing traffic engineering. I've got MPLS, right? So we've got all of our MPLS tables. How big does it get, right? If you don't think there are people who have V6 deployed who are worried about this, think again.
Good. In the middle and the back.
Actually, before you walk away, have you done any studies? Do you know when you're going to melt down if the current trend continues?
No.
Yeah.
So do we still think that the problem is V6 or is it multi-homing? Should the title of the slides be redone?
Is the problem
V6 or multi-homing?
That's a good question. As I hear it, the problem is V6 doesn't have scalable routing, and some people think that the increase in address...
No, it doesn't have different routing. Before, doesn't have scalable routing.
That's true.
Right, so...
Well, here's the issue. Here's the issue in a nutshell, which is that we have V4, we have V6, and the idea of doing a V4 to V6 transition, not necessarily our idea, but the idea that's sort of floating out there is that when we do this transition, it comes tightly coupled with it the idea that our routing problems will be solved because, for example, we won't let enterprises multi-home or whatever. It is a perfectly reasonable thing to say, okay, we're going to put off our scalable routing problem for 5 or 10 years or until the providers auger in, until the vendors can't provide equipment anymore, and we're going to do V6 just like V4, and we'll implement ARIN Public Policy 2005-1, and that's kind of the direction we're heading now, at least in North America. I can't answer that for right.
Right, so the hammer party of, we're going to destroy V6, once and for all. I mean,
but that's not what this is. This isn't a hammer party saying.
How bad is V6?
It's bad. It's bad. You have to understand that when you look.
No,
at
it's not V6 that's the problem.
Well, hold on here. I guess
we've created more addresses and we haven't figured out how to deal with them.
Right, but.
Right, you're saying, well, V6 is good, but all the multi-homing aspects of it are bad. I mean, the fact
all
is...
the multi-homing problems of V4 are the same?
Oh, no.
I think it's a question of scale, Tony, I really do.
Just the size of the...
Pardon me?
Just the size of the address?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, that's what generates the problem.
It exacerbates, yeah.
And the other thing is, right now, we have a working multi-homing solution. Unfortunately, when you look at things like Shim6, those aren't real-world workable multi-homing solutions.
Oh, no apologists here. I'm just trying to make sure we focus on the right thing.
Well, I guess when we say how bad is V6, we mean, not just the
how
V6
entertaining is
packet
it to put that on a slide? Yeah, that's what.
Well, I mean, let's be clear. The real point of having that on the slide was to get you to the mic, and it worked, right? So,
point taken.
But his original point is very important. What are the problems that we're trying to solve? And I think that was your original question, right, Tony?
Yeah.
And Tony,
Focus on the right thing, not the wrong thing.
I mean, I think you know, or maybe you know, that maybe the best thing we can get out of this IAB exercise is sort of a bunch of problems that we can kind of agree on are things that we want to work on, and maybe we can attack those.
And the title of the IAB workshop is what?
Pardon me?
What's the title of the IAB workshop?
Scalable routing and addressing architectures for the internet or something like that.
Okay.
Good. Over on the side.
David Farmer, University of Minnesota. The routing problem for V6 is real. I tend to agree that it doesn't quite need, an emergency solution at the moment. It'd be nice to have some work happening to solve it before it is an emergency. But right now, the way V6 deployment's going in enterprises, like next to nothing, you might want to give a little thought to solving some enterprises' problems with V6 with things like renumbering and some things that were punted on, so that CIOs have a reason to deploy it. Because all of you, the service providers can have all these great scalable V6 backbones, but if there are no customers for them running V6, what's the point?
But the thing is that, having talked to a lot of enterprises on this very topic, and a lot of CIOs, they are remarkably unconcerned with V6. And as you said, there's nothing in V6 that particularly interests them. And if you look at the problems they do have, very few of them can actually be addressed by V6. The reason they will go to V6 is when they absolutely have no other way of getting V4 addresses, because they have a priority list of important problems in the enterprise. And there are things related to security, there are things related to identity management and single sign-on. There are all kinds of things that are RFID. There are all kinds of things that are of huge importance to the enterprise. But this is so far down the list, and I'm not sure that it's worth trying to solve some CIO problem in order to make V6 attractive. I mean, that's V6 will be adopted when V6 is intrinsically attractive in its own right.
Well, the point I was trying to make was that in the original architecture, there was supposed to be some things in there that have been punted on, and at least in my opinion, that would have been attractive to see. It's darned expensive to renumber a V4 network. It's darned expensive to renumber a network. It's something that has to be done no matter what. Things happen, things change, you have to renumber networks. Attacking that problem is it going to really solve a particular problem of a CIO today? Well, some of them, but they've all had to renumber networks and have seen the problem.
To answer your issue there, renumbering is really low on the typical CIO worry list, because right now, you have certain technologies that are widely used in the enterprise, like DHCP, Microsoft Active Directory, which is tightly tied in with DNS and DHCP. Renumbering is actually an extremely small issue for enterprises. And of course, the other thing is they're mostly using NAT. I mean, 95% of enterprise IP address space is NATed, so they never have to renumber under any circumstances.
Well, if that's the way we're going to stay, then that's the argument for V4. There's enough V4 address space forever, which I don't believe.
What I'm saying is that enterprises really like NAT.
They do. So Jason wanted to run a straw poll to get the sense of the room. So go.
Yeah. So the question is, how many people think at some point we're actually going to run out of V4 addresses, or it'll be so difficult to get V4 addresses that we'll have to go to V6 or something else?
All right, so how many people think we will run out? So the majority of you think we're never going to run out of V4 addresses, or you're sleeping. How can you sleep? It's like raucous in here. There's conflict. There's interesting things happening.
This is the NANOG version of a street fight, guys.
Dude, this is as close as it gets to fun in this room. Yeah. Seriously. Seriously. All right, so people who think that we're going to run out of V4. All right, hands up, up. Anybody who thinks that? Okay, vast majority. Good, we're sane. So the next question was...
What about in the next 10 years?
In the next 10 years, how many people think we will have run out of unallocated V4 space? What? No, sometime within the next 10 years.
I think you're asking the wrong question.
Yeah.
I think Jeff Houston, whose name you might spell correctly without the O, would ask the question that you will not be able to get V4 space if you're willing to spend the money for it.
That's why I said unallocated.
Yeah, I think you're right, Randy.
I specifically disagreeing with your unallocated phrasing.
Very good. So, over there, I've been waiting a long time.
Hi, Abaladik Badigashin, Microsoft. I have a slide. This has actually been really interesting for me. I'll be speaking later on about some of the changes we've made in Windows Vista, and I'm curious to hear from the panelists. You probably know that Windows Vista will have IPv6 enabled by default, and that it will be preferred. In other words, if you have both V4 and V6 connectivity, it'll prefer V6. So I'm curious to hear whether you think that has any influence on anything you said, specifically on the urgency of the problem from the routing perspective, and secondly, also whether it has an impact on what alternatives you have available to you. One of the alternatives that sounded interesting to me was sort of keeping the address format but completely changing the protocol, which has huge implications for everyone who's, built software to execute V6 as it is.
Yep. Thoughts? Vista V6 by default matter? Not?
Well, since very few people route V6 anywhere, it may be on by default, but IPv4 is what people are going to be using. I mean, that's the de facto what's happening right now. So I don't know that putting thousands or hundreds of thousands of boxes out there that would like to do V6 if it was available will really make a difference. Well, I guess we'll have to see, but I mean, if people aren't carrying V6 other than, the toy number of routes that are out there right now, I don't see how it can really impact that vastly.
Well, specifically the question would be, would it actually change behavior? In particular, and we have lots of customers in Asia who are excited about actually having V6 available, such that it's not an extra download that their customers have to go after.
I think the point that Dave is trying to make is it really depends how many of these hosts are connected to networks that are V6 enabled. And I don't think the fact that Vista or any other operating system is operating with V6 in default mode is going to change how many networks are connected via V6. Now,
well,
it does potentially...
a counter argument, I really am asking your opinion, but I think, for instance, having a TCP/IP stack native in Windows 95 had a huge impact on demand for IPv4 connectivity several years ago when the internet was just getting started. So I'm just curious, do you actually think it will have no impact, moderate impact, a huge impact?
I think, unfortunately, most end users don't care. As long as they can open up their web browser and click on Microsoft.com and they can get there, they're happy. And they don't know whether they're doing V4 or V6.
They are going to care. Because they're going to have performance problems because it's going to fail in the connection and your NOCs are going to
so there's actually an interesting point that Randy's bringing up, and that is if you have a Vista box that's on a V6 enabled network and is connected to the internet only via V4, but because the PC thinks that there's a V6 internet available and it defaults to V6, it may actually look like performance is worse because it's going to try and do a DNS lookup over V6 and wait for that to time out.
Right.
I'll talk a little bit about that later during my talk.
And the problem with this is people are just going to turn it off.
And what's going to happen, that's exactly the case, is that enterprise network managers, not the end users. The end users are probably not going to care that much. But the enterprise network managers, the first thing they're going to do when they get Vista in the door and they use the tools that you guys provide to do a site-specific build for themselves to roll it out, they're going to turn off IPv6 until they decide they're going to turn it on an enterprise-wide basis. Because remember, it's not like they're going and saying, we're going to, in 2 days, we're going to replace everything in our organization with Vista, and we want to do our IPv6 transition at the same time. They're going to turn it off if they possibly.
Could you also talk a little bit about whether it changes the alternatives available to you in terms of solving the routing scalability problem?
Take a stab at it.
I think well, this is what I said on the last instance of this question. Basically, there's a lot of research going on in the routing research community, and there's work that people are trying to do in the IETF, but if the question you're asking is, what's the solution? Well, we don't know. We need to develop that solution. And the question that I think that's been, come up here on several occasions is, well, what is the time frame in which we have to do that? So the fact that we don't have a solution in hand right now is not necessarily fatal. We can still work on it. But there may be, there's a clock running of some variety.
Yeah, good.
So hold on, before we go to another question, I just wanted to make one other point. If Vista brings new functionality to the end user, it will absolutely make a big difference. If people in this room thought Shim6 was great and actually solves a problem, and you go and you implement Shim6 in the stack and people use it, will absolutely make a difference. Now, do I believe Shim6 is the answer? Not for me. Do I think it'll make a difference? Maybe in peer-to-peer networking? I don't know. But I think if you're bringing new functionality to the stack that's not there in v4, absolutely. I just don't see it today, though.
All right.
Just a comment on something about 4 or 5 comments ago about salespeople selling deaggregation. I think as long as we as engineers can beat the salespeople to the punch and enforce that as not being an option, then our lives will be a lot better and scalable.
How do you explain?
I just have one word for you. There's just no chance that's going to happen. Okay, just no chance.
I mean, putting it into the protocols.
There's just no way. If they can sell it, they're going to sell
Randy?
it.
Go ahead.
Randy Bush, IJ, sorry again. I have a confession to make. The beginning of next month, the ITF will meet in San Diego. In 1998, the ITF met in San Diego when I was still silly enough to give a lot of time to the ITF. And in order to communicate that the problem with v6 was routing, I called a BOF, and which became a working group, was discuss multi-homing in the context of IPv6. I did not mean for this to be the sole problem they were trying to solve. I was just trying to get across the point that routing is the problem, and that addressing without routing is death. All more bits does is make it look like it's bigger. The problem isn't that they aren't working on it. The problem isn't that 36 people aren't working on it. There are 2 problems. The first problem is the problem statement is poor. And Henning, I wish you knew something about routing. The problem statement is simple. It is scalable and it is scope. In other words, so that global state does not have to know everything about everything. The second, and getting everybody to agree on a clear problem statement is critical. The second is that it's a damned hard problem, and people aren't really thinking about it, and people who talk about endless stuff, we're not really, 99% of the population ain't smart enough to even work on this one.
No argument with any of that. I did want to, when I asked about who asked about the routing and addressing thing, I wanted to read something that Yakov told me at the very first IETF I ever went to. And what he said was, routing can follow topology, addressing can follow topology, or topology can follow addressing. Choose one. And that still remains true today, but we have, and it's sort of the source of all the problems, like as Randy said, you really can't decouple these things completely, and that was the point I wanted to make earlier when somebody mentioned that.
Good. Leo.
Hi, Leo Bicknell, Harris Entertainment. I'm struck by the grumpy old men here, because that seems to be all we have talking, and I'm actually pretty happy about this. I have a little bit of a different perspective, I think, than most of the people in the room. So my perspective is, way back in time, we sent the IETF a big, long laundry list of what we wanted to do. And it contained, depending on your count, somewhere between 5 to 10 to 15 things we wanted them to fix. And they ran off, and I won't comment on whether I think they did a good job or a bad job, but the result is they came back and said, well, here's 2 of them fixed. And we all don't like that. And I understand why we don't like that, and we should press them to fix the other, 3 to 10 or however many things need to be fixed. But the reality is what the clock is ticking on here isn't the end of the internet or any of these other things. The clock is ticking on us making a choice between a v6 deployed as is solution that admittedly has a short lifetime overall, or getting the other 3 to 8 to 10 things fixed and deploying everything at once. That's what the clock's ticking on. Because in the context of this slide, v6 actually does fix some things. It gives us more addresses. That was one of the goals. That's fixed. In terms of the routing system, I understand that there are many problems with scalable routing. I will suggest that v6 chipped away at it. And it may only be a 1% solution. It may be a 5% solution. I don't know. It's certainly not the entire solution. But hopefully from the classful days in our own history that we've all kind of gone through, we've learned how to allocate blocks better. I think we all have a hope that in general, traffic engineering aside, we can more or less allocate one block to each AS if we do it right. Having more addresses is a prerequisite to that. No one I've talked to has argued that. There's actually a belief that the v6 routing table, traffic engineering aside, will be smaller than the v4 routing table for the same number of participants, because we have learned from our mistakes. And I will submit that that's not enough to get us 100 years down the road. It's not a complete solution. But there are two areas there that v6 has delivered on. So the question that we're all asking ourselves is, should we jump headlong into v6, take these two fixes, and say, a 15, 20-year lifespan for those two fixes is good enough, and then we'll do something else? Or do we push the IETF, the vendors, and all that other stuff that, no, we're not going to roll out this v6 thing. You're going to fix it lock, stock, and barrel so we have a 150-year solution, and then we'll roll it out. But both paths forward are, in fact, paths forward. There is not a non-solution here.
Two questions for you, Leo. Do we really have that long? Does things change if it's 10 years or 5 years? And the second question is, you said there was a laundry list of 6 or 8 things. Is there 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 problems that we should solve now? And how many of these problems can wait 15, 20, 30 years?
I think certainly, and I hate to say this, I agree with Randy, the biggest problem is the routing system and its overall scalability, irrespective of v4, v6, v37, or whatever it may be. That is a very real problem, and he is correct. The number of people qualified to work on it can probably be counted on both hands and maybe your toes as well. I think that problem deserves lots of research and funding and effort, and it would be really nice if we could solve that before we ran out of v4 addresses so we could deploy it before v6. Pragmatically, I don't think it's going to happen. I think we will run out of v4 addresses, and thus we will be forced to deploy v6 whether or not those other problems have been solved. And I think what we will get is a reasonable lifetime out of v6. We've gotten, give or take, 30 years out of v4 from original conception to now, right? I think we can probably get 30 years out of v6 with the more or less current system. If we can limit it to mostly one block per AS, if the providers can limit it so we don't deaggregate all the way down to the /128, I think we can get 30 years out of it, and I think from a business perspective that's possibly acceptable.
Leo,
can we take a straw poll? How many people in the room would be willing to only advertise a single block per AS?
You lie. Oh, you're all lying.
What about people who want to do v4 style multi-homing or some kind of traffic engineering?
Well,
what do we just tell them?
I did not suggest that we could not do traffic engineering. I absolutely believe it will continue because it's the only solution. Multi-homing by announcing smaller blocks and traffic engineering will continue to occur. There's two important observations though. I'll pick on Jason because that is the theme of the day. UUNet advertises a ton of prefixes, not for traffic engineering, because they got them back when we did things different. And that's not a knock on them. We did things different. We gave out one class C at a time in completely non-aggregatable chunks because it was just the method of the day, right?
Absolutely.
A lot of that can go away if we do v6 allocations right, which Whether we're doing it right or not is a whole other story, but I think we're doing it good enough that won't occur. So it can be better. Maybe not as good as we would like, but better. And I think, again, with traffic engineering and deaggregates, we've all seen it today. People deaggregate down to the /24, but you know what? Pretty much everyone in this room has decided 24 is where you get cut off. If you want to deaggregate your /32s, they don't go anywhere. What should be the limit with v6? Should we filter on a 32 boundary, a 48 boundary, a 64 boundary, a /120 boundary? I don't know, but economics tells me we'll find a decent limit, one that we can generally live with. And there will be some people here pissed off that they can't deaggregate further, and there will be some people here very happy that they deaggregated enough to serve them. It'll be the way it is.
Just, we're running out of time, so if you're standing and waiting at the mic, you get to talk, and if you're not, you don't.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out there's 2 million times more /48s in IPv6 than there are /24s in IPv4.
Sure, but there aren't more people. There are a fixed number of businesses in the US, I don't know, 22 million or something like that. I don't have the statistic in front of me. I suggest that the curve for address space is like any other curve. If you look at demand curves for anything over time, it starts off slow, it goes really, really steep, possibly exponential, and it eventually levels off. You know, we just got a statistic in the US that there are now more TVs per household than individuals who live in the household. If you look at the growth in TV sales, it's flat to negative for most vendors with the exception of HDTV, right? Markets reach saturation. One of the things we've seen in this boom is there's all these companies in the world who weren't on the internet. They all got to get there. But once they're there, they don't got to get there again and again and again, right? There will be a natural leveling at some point. The question is, can we make it to that natural leveling point? Not can we continue this growth forever?
Okay. Thank you. Joe, you've been
Yeah, Joe Abley. I'm here to make a Windows comment, which makes me feel dirty. But just something that wasn't mentioned before. I'm told that certain pre-production releases of Vista have shipped with 3 options for v6 connectivity. You have native connectivity, you have 6-4, and you have Teredo. And I'm told that at least one of those was shipped with all those things turned on. So that in fact every single Windows desktop running Vista, if that's the model for deployment, will be v6 capable. So you could look at that and say, well, this is pushing the issue to now, which means we have to deal with it right now. Or you could take the cynical approach and say, well, what that means is every help desk in the world is going to be prepared to tell people exactly what the registry setting is to turn off v6 altogether, so that whenever anybody deploys v6 to the edge through the cable network or anything else, it'll make no difference because no one's going to use it.
Okay, first, sir, I'm going to need you to go to Start, Run, and regedit. Then I'm going to need you to select the following key. I'm going to need you to change the 1 to a 0 in the 47th key on the right pane.
I believe there are DSL providers who are adept at getting people to reduce their MSS, so I'm sure they can turn off v6.
Excellent. Raz.
Hey, Richard Steenberg and Inlayer. So when Leo said that we have solved the allocation problem, if we had done that, we would be allocating smarter. The issue right now is that we have just quadrupled our IP space size and increased it by however many trillions, and yet we've only increased the effective routing availability by 8 bits in the way that we're handing out space. It's going to recreate the swamp again. Everyone knows that. That's really what the issue is. And there are reasonable ways to solve this. We've already come up with a packet header that's reasonable. We've already burned it to ASIC in a lot of cases, and that can all be solved. You know, we can implement with the current hardware today, we can implement 8+8, and we could come up with something reasonable with a little bit of intelligence and a little bit of thought now before it gets deployed, before we get down to a crunch, and we should be working on that instead of standing around wasting our time on whatever this is.
Thank you so much for your kind comments, Richard. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, actually there was a comment on that. One of the things we've come to accept with IPv6 is the idea that we need to give 64 bits for a MAC address because of the idea that auto assignment is some kind of a benefit, or some kind of a wonderful thing. I don't know the history. That might have sort of predated the extremely wide-scale adoption and use of DHCP, which is not going to go away even if we go to IPv6, because enterprises needed to do all kinds of stuff. we may be wasting those 64 bits. I mean, I think a lot of us are saying we need to keep using the IPv6 packet header, but that doesn't necessarily mean we have to stay in love with the idea of wasting 64 bits to hold a MAC address.
Yep.
Another thing on that is this all derives from all of these IETF addressing architecture documents, and I don't think there's really anything, anything immutable about that. I mean, I think if all of this came along with, or somebody came along with 8+8 or something like that, that was shown, to be implementable, adoptable, and so forth, I think that could all be changed. I don't really feel that strongly that this stuff is law at all.
And yet, just to channel Randy, Randy says 8+8 and any sort of locator ID split's not going to help at all, because the slots in the global routing table aren't being burned for that reason. They're being burned for traffic engineering.
Sure. I mean, yeah.
It'll help. It's not at all, but it's not a panacea.
Yeah. Sure. Traffic engineering and multi-homing were really not addressed. Mike didn't address those in the original document.
Yeah, I mean, the question is, can you aggregate routing group in a way that's useful, that allows you to hide the topology, but still create traffic engineering? And if you do that, do you end up with less state than you do with more specifics?
So my reference to 8+8 was sort of just example.
Sure. Igor, last?
Yeah, Igor with Yahoo. We are a fairly large content provider that do quite a bit of traffic engineering. Wow. And I'm going to agree with Leo. Most of our advertisements or deaggregates aren't because we're doing traffic engineering. They're just a small percentage of them. Mostly it's because we've been handed very small blocks and we had to be really careful with where they go in order to meet HD ratios. And we just have a lot of small blocks allocated all over the place, and we can't aggregate them because it would mean renumbering everything. If we were giving bigger V4 blocks from the start, you'd be seeing maybe 10 prefixes instead of 80. Don't assume that what you see is intentional deaggregate for traffic engineering. It could be just a side effect of the address allocation policy. And with V6, the address allocation policy seems a lot cleaner, and you literally can say, this data center or whatnot is a 48. That may be good enough for most traffic engineering purposes. Please don't assume that we want to deaggregate down to a 64 for TE. We don't.
Good, thank you. We're running long on time, so brief closing thoughts from left to right, my left.
Let's see. Well, I think a lot of us, there's a lot of sort of instability in our thinking about this problem in this community, and I think for my part of trying to solve it, I'm really hoping we can get something out of this workshop, and I'm hoping that I can come and report on some good news about that at the next NANOG. But beyond that, it's good to see that everybody has some energy around this, because notwithstanding what people think the date or time of, whenever we're going to be facing a crunch problem, at least folks are thinking about it, and I think that's a good thing. So,
Dan?
I think we're right now, for good or ill, we're heading to a default solution. And the default solution seems to be IPv6 with provider-independent address space. And that's because Aaron has short-circuited the IETF on this. I'm not sure that's sort of a stable long-term moving forward into the future solution, although I think it's much more optimal than what we would have had with something like shim6. I think we do have to pay some attention to it at this point, and hopefully try to solve this, because I think if we kind of fiddle around for another 10 years, I don't think we want to be in a crisis. Certainly letting things fall into a crisis is one way to solve this, but considering how important the internet is to our economy now and in the future, I think it might be a little irresponsible to let there become a major crisis before we actually tackle a problem that may take multiple years.
Jason?
Yeah, I think the hardest thing in the past couple of years has been getting people together to agree on which are the problems that we want to solve. And I think what we really need to do is get the operators together to speak with one voice, to clearly state, simply state, what are the problems that need to be solved now with a narrow scope, and take that to the IETF and get them to work on the protocol and give us a solution. And in lieu of that, everyone going and beating up their vendors and saying, I need a box that's 2, 3, 4, 5 times bigger than what I have now, and I need it next year or next week or whatever the case may be.
All right, on that note, we're running late. Thank you all for your participation. I hope this was somehow useful.